Welcome to my art appreciation classes, online class and the on-campus class. This is a continuation of some lectures I did last week where I was practicing comparisons, kind of demonstrating ways that you could compare two works and focus primarily on formal issues. I think the last time we were talking about this comparison between this Sebastiano Ricci painting here and this Kirchner here, a German expressionist painting. And there are a number of ways. I think the primary way we're talking about the diagonal organization of this composition versus the triangular organization of this composition. The way this composition is a little bit faster and there's not as many areas of focus. It's a very kind of fast dynamic along the figure and then back and forth between the figure and the reflection. Obviously, the dynamic of the shoulder and head up here is a major area of focus, and then the feet are another major area of focus. Whereas in the Ricci, it's much slower. We can see it much more as like a kind of a long, elaborate visual pathway that kind of plays into this idea of visual pathway as a journey. Also, like a lot of Renaissance and Baroque art, the areas of light are the areas, the areas of light that are coming out of the overall darkness are the primary areas of focus. So we have kind of a tertiary focus here. This is more of an area of focus on the Joseph figure, and then here with Mary and the baby, and I believe this is probably or the child, John the Baptist. Those are the primary areas of focus. But even look how the foot becomes an area of focus, and a lot of it has to do with both local value, areas of light, as well as this idea of like these spots of lighting shining on the figure, revealing certain things. And another way we can compare this is in terms of color. We talked, I think, about value contrast, and I would say it's kind of hard to contrast these two because their approach to value is so different, right? We can certainly say that the value range on the Kirchner is much wider, with these really, really darkest darks, and this kind of pure white, lightest light. Whereas in the Ricci we have just a slightly narrower range, and it definitely also seems like the movement of light is a little bit slower in the Ricci. It has that kind of afternoon, late, sun setting kind of evening, somewhere between late afternoon and early evening kind of light. And the Kirchner doesn't have necessarily any clear specific kind of light, but there's this sense of just overall a sharp shift between colors and values on every area. A lot of the breakdown of color seems to be very much just sort of like as a defining of the local value or local temperature of the thing. Another way to approach these is to think about how they use line. Like many Baroque compositions, the composition is both organized around very kind of geometric structures, right, which would be kind of straight, linear kind of structures, but then the shapes within it and the lines of the drawing of the figure are these more elegant and very kind of curvilinear flowing sort of lines that flow between shapes, whereas the lines of the Kirchner are much more active, more angular, quicker, and more strongly placed and stated. I think probably that is probably the most significant difference between the two, is that the Kirchner, being a modernist work, is much more willing to just let a shape be a shape, a line be a line, an area of texture be a texture, rather than to paint everything out in thin layers, trying to hide the line, trying to hide the changes of color. And so the Ricci is more illusionistic in terms of, and I guess another way we can compare these in terms of representation, right? The Ricci is more illusionistic, and its representation is much more focused on the mood and the atmosphere of the space and focused on the light, whereas the representation in the Kirchner is in some ways more literal, but also um, um, more abstract, right? More, like I said, trying to emphasize just the drawing and the line and the shape as decisions rather than as an illusion of any kind of believable person in a space. Yeah, we can, the more we look at this painting, the more we can clearly see the setup, how she might have been in the studio, how the blanket was lying, where the mirror was placed on the wall. So there's a lot more we could discuss between these two, but I think probably that's a good place to stop. So in terms of comparing these two works, the first thing we would notice would be one of their major similarities. Both paintings are creating deep space, and they're doing it in a linear one-point perspective system, and they're also doing it with these big kind of archways. If you really look carefully, you can see that this is more of a groin vaulting kind of system, more like something like what we might see in a Romanesque church, whereas here we have much more of a Renaissance barrel vault. But basically we've got these kind of circular base vaulting system in a one-point perspective in both paintings. But just looking at the perspective system, there is a significant difference. Our eye level is much lower here in the Anselm Kiefer, right? We're much closer to the ground plane, and the ceiling is much higher above us, whereas the eye level is higher in the, there's more of a sense we see a little bit more of the ground plane. So our eye level is higher in the Raphael. And then on top of it also there's this added element that the whole thing is raised up, so it even adds to that effect as well. So in terms of color, we could say in the Anselm Kiefer that it is a much more muted palette, primarily dominated by low intensity colors, blacks and grays, and earth tones and earth reds. And whereas in the Raphael, there's a more colorful, but the color is organized really around these sort of spots of color that are organized by local color, right? That the local color changes, you know, like as one person is wearing this color robe or another color robe. So the overall space is quite light and quite low intensity in this kind of sort of halfway, I don't know, kind of sepia, almost terre verte type of grisaille kind of treatment, very low intensity for the whole space. But then the figures are each individually like have much more intensity of color, but each color is very much kind of like specifically localized to that one area, and but then repeats. So we have similar reds repeating around similar blues, repeating around similar kind of amber yellows repeating. And that the repetition of color is partially what leads our eye from place to place, but it is very local color organized, and it's very much small spots of color within this overall. I kind of already hinted at the difference in terms of the value in the paintings. Overall, the value in the Kiefer is much darker, whereas the overall value in the Raphael is much lighter. Probably it's value conscious is a little bit hard to to judge, being that they're so different from each other in terms of their overall range. But I'd have to say that the Kiefer has a wider range, because some of these lightest lights are quite light, and obviously the darkest darks in the Kiefer are way darker than any of the values in the Raphael. And in terms of speed of gradation, I don't know. I don't think that's a comparison that quite yields much information. The light feels kind of slow, and like you have a feeling in the Raphael of the light being very well lit, like evenly lit all around. So we have kind of a slow gradation of light, and even as things move into shadows, the shadows feel like they have a lot of fill light to them. Whereas in the Kiefer, it's a different kind of slowness, in the slowness of a very dark space with not much light in it whatsoever. So